I've never missed a payment. I have 18 years of statements here.
That's an issue between you and your bank, not something we're responsible for.
Margaret Coleman had lived at 14 Hollow Creek Lane for 38 years. She and her husband Walter bought the house the same month she signed her first teaching contract at Brookstone Elementary, back when the neighborhood was still half finished. Bare lots on either side, a single sidewalk running past 3 completed houses, and a homeowners association that consisted of Walter and 2 other men who mowed the shared green space themselves on Saturday mornings, because no one else was going to. Margaret used to bring out lemonade while they worked. That was the whole association budget for the first 4 years, lemonade and gas money for the mower. She raised 2 daughters in that house. Sarah was born in the upstairs bedroom that faced the oak tree 2 weeks early, with Walter driving so fast to the hospital that a police officer pulled him over and then escorted them the rest of the way with lights on. Rachel came 4 years later, quieter, easier, the kind of baby who slept through storms. Margaret graded spelling tests at the kitchen table for 31 years, a fresh stack every Sunday night, red pen in hand, the radio playing low so she wouldn't wake the girls. She knew every crack in that kitchen table's finish. She knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked and which one didn't, information she'd used for years to sneak into her daughters' rooms after nightmares without waking them fully. Walter got sick in the winter 2 years ago. Pancreatic, the kind of diagnosis where the doctors use the word manage instead of cure from the very first appointment. Margaret retired 8 months early to take care of him, though she never told the school district the real reason. She said family circumstances, and the principal, a kind woman who'd taught alongside Margaret for a decade, didn't push. They moved a hospital bed into the living room in the fall so Walter could still see the garden through the bay window, the garden he'd built with his own hands the first summer they lived there, expanded every year since tomatoes, then roses, then the small stone path he'd laid himself one vertebrae-punishing weekend when Sarah was in middle school. He died in March, on a Tuesday morning, with Margaret holding his hand and the garden just beginning to bud outside the window he was facing. The bills started arriving before the funeral flowers had finished wilting. Insurance covered most of the hospital stays, but not the home hospice care, not the specialist visits in the final 2 months, not the medical equipment rental that somehow cost more per month than Margaret's mortgage once had. She sat at that same kitchen table late at night, red pen traded for a calculator, moving numbers between columns the way she used to move a grade between a B+ and an A-, looking for a version of the math that came out differently than it actually did. She was 68 years old. Her income was a teacher's pension and Social Security, together just over $3,000 a month, and she found herself, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely afraid of what might be inside an envelope before she opened it. She didn't tell her daughters how bad it had gotten. Sarah was 2 states away with 3 kids under 10 and a husband who traveled for work 4 days out of 7. Rachel had just started a new position at a Chicago law firm, the kind of job where the first year determined whether there'd be a second one. Margaret had spent her whole life being the person her daughters called when something went wrong, and she didn't know how to reverse that direction. So when they called on Sundays, she told them she was doing fine, the garden was coming back nicely, she'd started a book club at the library. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. Brookstone Estates had changed almost beyond recognition since those early Saturday mornings with the shared mower. It now had 412 homes, a management contract with a regional company called Ferris Dunlap Community Services, and an elected board of 7 residents who oversaw an annual operating budget just north of $2 million. Vivian Ashcroft had been elected board president 2 years earlier, running unopposed after the previous president stepped down citing burnout. Her campaign flyer, which Margaret still had somewhere in a kitchen drawer, promised to restore property values through stricter enforcement of community standards. She had, in her first year alone, revised the landscaping ordinance twice, created a design review committee with authority over anything visible from the street, and raised late payment fees from $25 to $200. Some residents appreciated the tidier common areas. Others had started calling her, quietly, at book club and over back fences, the sheriff. Vivian had heard the nickname exactly once, at a community picnic, and had smiled in a way that made clear she considered it a compliment rather than a criticism. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September, 7 months after Walter's funeral. It came in a cream envelope with the Brookstone Estates seal embossed in the corner, and it sat propped against the sugar bowl on Margaret's kitchen table for 4 days, because her reading glasses had gone missing again. She'd taken to losing things more often since Walter died: small things, keys and glasses, and the thread of a sentence mid-conversation, and she kept meaning to look for them before opening the mail. It was her neighbor Dot Pemberton, arriving Thursday afternoon with a casserole dish and the particular brand of concern reserved for widows 6 months out, who finally read the letter aloud at the kitchen table while Margaret poured coffee. 30 days delinquent, balance owed, $1,140, including a $200 late fee and a lien processing charge of $90. Dot stopped reading halfway through and looked up. "Margaret, that can't be right. You've never missed a payment in your life." Margaret hadn't. The dues came out of her checking account automatically on the 1st of every month. The same account, the same automatic transfer, set up 18 years earlier when the association first began accepting electronic payments. She'd never once had to think about it. She called the HOA office that same afternoon, phone shaking slightly in her hand, which she noticed and hated noticing. A young man named Trevor answered, his voice carrying the particular boredom of someone reading from a script for the 4th time that day. He pulled up her account and told her, in the same flat tone, that no payment had been received since June. Margaret told him that was impossible, that her bank would show the transfers going through. Trevor said he didn't have access to bank-side records, only what showed in the association's system, and that per policy, any account reaching 60 days delinquent would automatically be referred to the association's collection attorney. Margaret asked to speak to someone who could actually look into the discrepancy. Trevor said he could transfer her to a voicemail box, and did, before she'd finished the sentence agreeing to it. The voicemail went unanswered for 6 days. Margaret drove to the HOA office the following Monday morning, a folder under her arm that she'd assembled the night before with the same care she used to grade final exams. 18 years of bank statements, printed at the library because her home printer had run out of ink months ago, and she hadn't gotten around to buying more. Every auto-pay confirmation email she could find, all of it organized chronologically with sticky tabs. The office itself had changed as much as the neighborhood had. What used to be a converted garage with a folding table was now a proper suite in a small professional building off the main boulevard, glass doors, a reception desk, a waiting area with 2 leather chairs no one ever seemed to sit in. Vivian Ashcroft's office was at the end of the hall, glass-walled, overlooking the retention pond that had replaced the last of the original bare lots. Her desk was glass as well, bare except for a laptop, a single framed photo angled toward her own chair rather than visitors, and a nameplate that still had the faint sheen of something recently engraved: President, Board of Directors, Brookstone Estates Homeowners Association. She was on the phone when Margaret arrived, and gestured for her to wait in the doorway for nearly a full minute before finishing the call and setting the receiver down with the particular precision of someone who liked being watched taking her time. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, and didn't stand. "I understand there's some confusion about your account." Margaret stepped forward and set the folder on the glass desk, opening it to the first tab. I've never missed a payment.
I have
I
18
have
years of
18 years of
statements.
statements here showing the automatic transfer going through every single month, including June and July. Vivian glanced down at the folder without picking it up, her eyes moving across the top page for perhaps 4 seconds before she closed it and slid it a few inches back across the desk toward Margaret. The association switched payment processors back in March, she said. If your bank hadn't updated the new routing information on file, that would explain a gap. But that's an
That's an
issue
issue
between
between you and
you
your
and your
bank,
financial
not
institution,
something we're
not
responsible
something
for.
Brookstone is responsible for reconciling. I never received any notice about a change in processors, Margaret said. That's surprising, Vivian said, in a tone that suggested it wasn't surprising to her at all. The notice went out to every household in the community, first-class mail, back in April. She said it with the specific, unhesitating confidence of a fact that had been prepared in advance rather than recalled on the spot. Could I see a copy of that notice? Vivian picked up a pen. Margaret would remember much later that it was an ordinary ballpoint, not the kind of prop pens people bought to signal authority, which somehow made it worse, and wrote a short line on a legal pad angled so Margaret couldn't read it. "I'll have someone pull it from the archive and follow up with you," she said. "These things take a little time to locate once we're past the current billing cycle." Margaret thanked her, the way people thank someone who has just told them a problem is being handled, because for 68 years that was the shape apologies and resolutions had generally taken in her life. A person in a position of some authority said they would look into something, and eventually, mostly, they did. She gathered her folder and left, and Vivian Ashcroft did not look up from her legal pad as she went. 3 weeks passed. No follow-up call came. No copy of the processor notice arrived in the mail. What arrived instead, on a Friday in early October, was a second letter. This one on the stationery of a law firm Margaret had never heard of, Kessler and Voigt, informing her that a lien in the amount of $1,820 had been recorded against the property at 14 Hollow Creek Lane, the new figure reflecting additional attorney's fees and administrative costs. And that failure to resolve the balance within 30 days could result in the association initiating foreclosure proceedings pursuant to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions she had signed at closing in 1987. Margaret read the letter twice at the kitchen table, in the same chair she graded 1,000 spelling tests from, the same chair she'd been sitting in the night the hospital called about Walter's first diagnosis. She cried then, for the first time in 8 months anywhere other than the shower, where she'd taken to letting the water run longer than necessary so the sound would cover it. She thought about calling her daughters. She didn't. She thought instead that she must have made some mistake she couldn't see, some form she'd forgotten to sign, some box she'd forgotten to check, because the alternative, that a woman behind a glass desk had simply decided not to help her twice, for no reason Margaret could identify, didn't fit anywhere in her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. She went back to the HOA office the following Monday. This time Vivian didn't gesture toward the chair at all. She stood behind the glass desk with her arms crossed and told Margaret the matter was now with the association's legal counsel and out of her hands entirely as board president. Margaret asked, as evenly as she could manage, how a balance of $1,140 had grown to $1,820 in the space of 3 weeks. Vivian said that was a question better directed to Kessler and Voigt, since attorneys' fees were assessed according to their own billing schedule, not the association's. Margaret asked, quietly, whether Vivian remembered telling her 3 weeks earlier that she would look into the notice. Vivian said she handled a great many resident matters in a given week and couldn't be expected to recall every conversation in detail, and reminded Margaret that she was welcome to formally dispute the lien in writing, though she should be aware the association's legal fees would continue to accrue during any dispute process, regardless of its outcome. She delivered that last sentence with something in her expression that Margaret couldn't quite name at the time, but which she would think about often in the months that followed, a kind of quiet, private satisfaction, the look of someone watching a plan proceed exactly as intended. What Margaret didn't know, walking out of that office for the second time with her folder of useless records under her arm, was that she was not the only person in Brookstone Estates receiving letters like this. 3 streets over on Larkspur Court, a widower named Frank Alvarez had received an almost identical notice 2 weeks earlier about a payment processor chain he also had no memory of being told about, for a balance that had also appeared, seemingly from nowhere, after 19 years of clean, uninterrupted payments. 2 blocks past that, on Winding Oak Drive, a woman named Patricia Nkemelu, raising her 2 grandchildren alone since her daughter's car accident the previous year, working double shifts at the hospital to cover the gap her daughter's income used to fill, had gotten the same letter, the same lien, the same wall of silence when she'd called asking for documentation of the notice she'd supposedly received. None of the 3 of them knew about the others yet. They lived within a half-mile of each other, shopped at the same grocery store, occasionally waved from their driveways, and had no idea they were each, individually, coming to the same private and devastating conclusion: that somewhere, somehow, they had failed to keep track of their own affairs. It would be another 6 weeks before any of them learned they weren't failing at anything at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The October board meeting was open to residents, held the second Tuesday of every month in the clubhouse behind the community pool, a room that still smelled faintly of chlorine no matter the season. Margaret went with her folder, arriving early enough to get a seat in the second row, hoping that a room full of neighbors might make Vivian answer a straight question differently than she had across a glass desk with no witnesses. 20-some residents filled the folding chairs that night, more than usual, because the agenda included a vote on next year's dues increase, and people who ignored every other meeting tended to show up for that one. Public comment came near the end, after the budget presentation, after a lengthy discussion about whether the pool's opening hours should extend by 30 minutes in summer. Margaret stood when her turn came, folder in hand, and asked calmly, she thought, though her voice wavered slightly on the second sentence, why she'd never received the processor chain, notice the board claimed had gone out in April, and why her balance kept growing every time she tried to resolve it. Vivian answered from the podium in a register built for the room rather than for Margaret specifically, patient and faintly weary, the tone of someone explaining something simple to a person struggling to keep up. She said the association followed an identical notification process for every homeowner, first-class mail to the address on file, and that she couldn't be held responsible for the reliability of individual mail delivery. A board member near the end of the table nodded along without looking up from his phone. Someone in the back row, a man Margaret didn't recognize, murmured something to his wife that Margaret didn't catch the whole of, only the phrase, "keeping good records anymore," said with the particular gentleness people use when they've already decided you're the problem. Margaret sat back down before she'd finished saying what she'd meant to say next, her folder still open on her lap. Frank Alvarez stood up 2 speakers later. He was 71, a retired electrician, built like a man who'd spent 4 decades doing physical work and had the shoulders to prove it, and his voice didn't waver the way Margaret's had. He described almost the identical sequence, a processor notice he'd never received, a balance that grew every time he tried to address it, a lien letter from the same law firm, Kessler and Voigt. Vivian's expression changed for less than a second, something tightening around her eyes before smoothing back into practiced patience, a change so brief that most of the room wouldn't have caught it. Margaret caught it, because she'd spent 31 years learning to read the small, involuntary things children's faces did right before they lied about homework. And adults, she was learning, weren't so different. Vivian gave Frank the same answer, nearly word for word, that she'd given Margaret 3 weeks earlier. Patricia Nkemelu didn't speak that night. She sat in the back row, having heard secondhand from a neighbor 2 days earlier that other people in the community were having trouble with their HOA accounts, and she'd come specifically to listen rather than to be seen. She wrote both Margaret's and Frank's names in the small notebook she carried for grocery lists and her grandchildren's school schedules, underlining them twice, and left before the meeting officially adjourned. Margaret and Frank found each other in the parking lot afterward, more or less by accident, both of them lingering near their cars longer than necessary, the way people do when they're not ready to be alone yet with whatever just happened inside. Frank recognized her folder before he recognized her face. It was, he'd say later, nearly identical to his own, right down to the color of the sticky tabs. They compared letters under the clubhouse parking lot's single working streetlight, and the language was close enough to identical that Frank read a paragraph aloud from his own letter while Margaret followed along in hers, both of them a half-beat behind, like reading the same hymn from two different books. Patricia joined them a few minutes later, having circled back after seeing them still standing there. She didn't introduce herself so much as simply say, "You're talking about the processor letter, aren't you?" and produced her own copy from her purse before either of them had answered. 3 people, 3 nearly identical lien letters, 3 attorneys' fees compounding on balances that had each started under $2,000 and were each growing roughly $200 a week. Frank was the one who finally said out loud what none of them had let themselves say yet, that this didn't look like a mistake that had happened 3 separate times by pure coincidence. It looked, he said, like something being done on purpose and done specifically to people least likely to have the time, money, or stamina to fight it. An elderly widow, an elderly widower, a grandmother working double shifts. None of them had a lawyer on retainer. None of them had the kind of free afternoons it took to sit in a courthouse waiting room contesting a lien. Margaret didn't sleep well that night, or most nights that followed. She kept turning over the exact phrase Vivian had used across that glass desk, not something Brookstone is responsible for reconciling, and thinking about how carefully constructed it was, how it managed to sound procedural rather than cruel, the kind of sentence built to survive being repeated back in front of a room full of people. She thought about Walter and what he would have said walking out of that office, and suspected it would have been considerably less polite than anything she'd managed to say herself. November brought no relief. Margaret's balance, now sitting at just over $2,400, generated a new letter from Kessler and Voigt informing her that the firm had filed a notice of intent to foreclose with the county recorder's office, and that she had 30 days to satisfy the debt in full, or the process would proceed to a public auction of the property. The letter was addressed, with a kind of clinical precision that Margaret found almost more upsetting than the number itself, to Margaret A. Coleman, occupant, as though 38 years of living there had reduced her, on paper, to a temporary condition. Frank received a nearly identical notice the same week. Patricia's arrived 3 days later, hers slightly further along than the others, since her balance had originated a month earlier than theirs and had been compounding longer. The 3 of them began meeting in Margaret's kitchen. The same table, the same chair Margaret had cried in, comparing notes, trying to find a pattern they could take somewhere official. Frank had a cousin who'd once worked in title insurance and thought there might be something to report to the state's Real Estate Commission, though none of them were entirely sure what a real estate commission actually did or how one went about contacting it. Patricia, exhausted from back-to-back hospital shifts, kept apologizing for not having more time to help dig through records, and Margaret kept telling her there was nothing to apologize for, though privately she worried that exhaustion was exactly the condition someone like Vivian Ashcroft was counting on. It was during one of these kitchen table sessions in mid-November that Margaret finally broke the silence she'd been keeping with her own family for 8 months. Rachel called on a Sunday, as she did every week, and asked, the way she always did, how her mother was doing. Margaret opened her mouth to say fine, the same word she'd used every Sunday since Walter's funeral, and instead found herself telling her daughter everything. The letter she couldn't read without her glasses, the processor notice that never existed, the growing balance, the foreclosure filing sitting on her kitchen counter at that very moment. Rachel didn't interrupt. She let her mother get all the way to the end, and when Margaret finally stopped, Out of breath in a way that had nothing to do with her lungs, Rachel was quiet for a moment before she said, in a voice Margaret didn't entirely recognize, steadier, more focused than her usual Sunday afternoon tone, "Mom, I need you to email me every single one of these letters tonight. Every date, every name. And I want you to tell Marcus everything you just told me because he's going to want to see this." Margaret liked her son-in-law well enough. Marcus Webb was quiet at family dinners, the kind of quiet that came from listening rather than having nothing to say, always the one who caught an error on a restaurant bill before anyone else noticed. She knew, in the general and slightly incurious way one sometimes knows things about family members whose daily lives don't often intersect with one's own, that he worked for the state attorney general's office. She had never asked precisely what that meant day to day, and he had never volunteered it, and 8 months ago Margaret would have said that was simply the shape of their relationship, pleasant, a little formal, built more around shared holidays than shared conversation. Marcus called that same evening, an hour after Rachel's call ended. His voice on the phone was calm in a way that Margaret found immediately, if inexplicably, reassuring, not the calm of someone unbothered, but the calm of someone who had clearly done this kind of listening before and knew exactly what questions to ask. He had her walk him through the timeline twice, asked her to spell Kessler and Voigt, asked whether the lien filings referenced a case number, and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she knew the names of any other homeowners going through something similar. Margaret gave him Frank and Patricia's names, along with Patricia's cousin's half-formed idea about the real estate commission. Marcus thanked her, told her explicitly not to pay anything or sign anything without calling him first, and said he'd be in touch within the week. What Margaret didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for another 2 months, was that the office Marcus worked for had already opened an investigation into a cluster of suspiciously similar HOA lien complaints across 4 counties, 11 of them so far, all following a pattern that was becoming difficult to describe as coincidence. A claimed processor switch that no homeowner could ever get documentation for, fees compounding faster than any recorded covenant permitted, and a property management company, Ferris Dunlap Community Services, the same company managing Brookstone Estates, that took a contractual percentage of every foreclosure sale that closed under its watch. Marcus wasn't simply an attorney who happened to work in that office. He ran the Consumer Protection Division's Real Estate Fraud Unit, and Brookstone Estates' management contract had been sitting near the top of an open case file for 3 months before his mother-in-law's name appeared in a spreadsheet his team had been building since August. 9 days passed after Margaret's call to Marcus without a follow-up, 9 days in which she told herself repeatedly not to worry, that he'd said he'd be in touch within the week, and it had only been slightly longer than that, that people in busy offices sometimes ran behind schedule. She was still telling herself that on the morning the auction notice arrived, a single sheet, county letterhead, informing her that the property at 14 Hollow Creek Lane would be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps in 6 days to satisfy the recorded lien, now totaling just over $3,100 with accumulated fees. The association's attorneys had moved faster than anyone had told Margaret they were capable of moving, and faster, it turned out, than Muckaza's own investigation had been prepared to intercept. Margaret called Rachel immediately, her voice climbing toward the kind of panic she'd been holding at bay for 2 months. Rachel told her to breathe, that Muckaz already knew, that he'd been aware of the accelerated filing for 2 days and was already working on it, but wouldn't say more than that over the phone, which did very little to calm Margaret down in the moment. Frank and Patricia had gotten similar notices the same week. Theirs weren't due for auction quite as soon, Margaret's balance having crossed the threshold first, but the timeline for all 3 was now compressed into weeks rather than months. The 3 of them spent the next several days doing the only thing that felt like doing something, organizing paperwork, calling neighbors, drafting a letter to the county recorder that none of them were confident would matter. The morning of the auction was cold and overcast, the kind of gray November sky that made everything look slightly flattened. Margaret arrived at the courthouse steps a full 40 minutes early, her folder, the same one, worn soft at the corners now from months of handling, clutched against her chest like something that could still protect her. A small crowd had gathered by the time the auctioneer set up his podium. A few curious neighbors, a couple of investors who showed up to every foreclosure auction in the county regardless of the property, and Vava Ashcroft, standing near the front in a cream blazer, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the particular stillness of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again without incident. The bidding opened at the outstanding lien amount and climbed quickly past that, past 200,000, past 300. Investors recognizing a solid property in a desirable neighborhood being sold for a fraction of its worth over a debt that had started under $1,200. Someone in the small crowd, Pumbatan, it turned out, who'd come without telling Margaret she was coming, murmured to the woman beside her that it wasn't right. A house like that going for a lien that size, and the woman beside her agreed, but neither of them said anything louder than a murmur, because that was what you did at an auction you watched. Vavain didn't turn around at the sound of it. She never did. The bidding reached $412,000 with the auctioneer's gavel raised, the count beginning going once, when a car pulled up at speed along the curb behind the small crowd, and Muckas stepped out, not alone. 2 investigators from his office flanked him, and a woman Margaret didn't recognize was already on her phone, walking briskly toward the county clerk's table set up near the courthouse steps. Muckas moved directly through the crowd to the auctioneer's podium and produced a folded document, a court order, signed that same morning by a superior court judge, halting the sale of 14 Hollow Creek Lane and freezing all pending Brookstone Estates foreclosure actions pending a formal investigation into the association's lien practices. The auctioneer, gavel still raised, read the order twice before lowering his arm. Vavain turned at the commotion, expecting perhaps a frustrated relative, a last-minute lawyer of the kind she'd seen show up at auctions before and successfully ignored. What she got instead was Mucka's wub, introducing himself not as Margaret's son-in-law, a fact he mentioned only after, almost as an afterthought, but as Deputy Attorney General heading the state's Real Estate Fraud Division, the same division that had spent 3 months building a file on Forrest Dunlop Community Services and 11 other homeowners with lien histories that mirrored Margaret's down to the wording of the letters. He told Vavain, in the same level, unhurried voice he'd used on the phone with Margaret 9 days earlier, that her office's financial records, payment processor logs, and board meeting minutes for the past 3 years were now subject to subpoena, effective immediately. Margaret watched the color leave Vavain's face the way it does when a script relied on for years suddenly runs out of lines, and something in Margaret's chest loosened for the first time in 2 months. The investigation took 10 weeks, longer than Margaret expected and shorter, Muckas told her privately, than most cases of this size usually ran. It confirmed what his office had begun to suspect months earlier. The processor change notices had never been mailed to anyone at all. Forrest Dunlop Community Services had been manufacturing false delinquencies on a rotating list of homeowner accounts, disproportionately elderly residents, recently widowed residents, and residents like Patricia carrying the kind of caregiving burden that left little time or energy to fight back, generating more than $400,000 in fraudulent fees and foreclosure-linked sale commissions across 4 counties over roughly 3 years. Vavain Ashcroft, records showed, had personally approved 11 of those foreclosure referrals herself, including Margaret's, Frank's, and Patricia's, each approval logged with her digital signature and a timestamp that left no ambiguity about who had known what and when. Vavain was removed from the board within days of the subpoenaed records becoming public and was charged, alongside two Forrest Dunlop employees, with fraud and elder financial exploitation. At her arraignment, reporters gathered on the courthouse steps not far from where the auction had nearly concluded 2 months earlier, and Vovan told them she had simply followed the recommendations of the association's financial staff. Nearly the identical phrasing, worded almost sentence for sentence, that she'd once used across a glass desk to a woman holding 18 years of bank statements. No one who had sat across from her in that office believed it, and this time, it was said in front of enough witnesses that it didn't matter whether they did. Margaret's lien was vacated in full. So were Frank's and Patrasha's, along with 8 others uncovered over the course of the investigation, and the state ordered full restitution for every fraudulent fee collected, plus statutory damages that Patrasha, in particular, badly needed and had never expected to see. Brookstone Estates held new board elections that spring, and the association's bylaws were permanently amended to require mandatory third-party financial audits. A policy Frank Olvera's, of all people, the retired electrician who'd once wondered aloud what a real estate commission even did, ended up nominated to help oversee as the board's new treasurer. On a clear morning the following spring, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the garden Walter had built slowly come back to life after a long winter, new growth pushing up along the stone path he'd laid with his own hands. Rachel and Muckas visited most Sundays now, and Margaret had finally told both her daughters everything, not just the HOA letters, but the 8 months before them, the bills she'd hidden, the fear she'd carried alone at that kitchen table long before Vovan Ashcroft's name ever entered her life. She still kept the folder. It sat in the same kitchen drawer as her reading glasses now, always within reach, not because she needed it anymore, but because it had become, in its own quiet way, proof that she had never once been the one who was wrong. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.